for that generous introduction, Pranav. And before I begin, I really do want to offer and extend my sincere thanks to Hina Khalid, Pranav Prakash, and Ankur Barua for all the extensive logistical support that putting something like this together, which involves collaboration over several different time zones involved. So thank you. What I'm presenting today is actually something that I have been working on since the pandemic, as all of us were reduced to moving much of our work online. And it's not something that fits easily into any of the book projects I'm currently working on, but I am really excited to get feedback from the scholars in this virtual space because I do hope to be able to develop this a little bit further. So let me get started. The title of my talk, as we mentioned, is actually, just give me a space. I'm having my screen is frozen. So I might have to snap out of this because I cannot actually get into my screen anymore. I cannot see my screen bar at all. Let's stop sharing for a second. Yeah, that's better. Okay, so resisting religious labels in early modern Punjab.
Sorry, yeah. You're not seeing slides now, right?
I'm seeing the slides, yeah.
But we are not.
Oh, that's unfortunate. Okay. Can you see it now?
No. If you like, I could share on your behalf.
Here, let me try again, and then we might need to do that. I'm not quite sure why this isn't working. Should I email it to you then?
Yeah, sure. Email it to me and I'll share it on your behalf. Just let me know when to move the slides.
Okay, sorry about that. Feel free to pause the recording while we do this.
Okay, yeah, I'll pause the recording.
Today, if you are on a plane, say, on a very clear day, if you are on the Indian side of the Indo-Pakistan border at this village called Naushahar Dalla in Taran Taran, and if you gaze across the Indo-Pakistan border, through the tree canopy that partially blocks your view, you would see a dilapidated Gurudwara dedicated to the sixth Guru, Guru Har Gobind, off in the distance. Before 1947, when the border did not separate these two closely nestled sites, this particular set of buildings attracted a very large group of pilgrims, everyday visitors, who would visit both of these spaces that were regionally significant. It was partly through their efforts that the Gurudwara that commemorated Guru Har Gobind's visit to this area in the 17th century was built, sponsored by the Jat Sandhu clan, who became eventually the zamindars of this region. The other Gurudwara, the one dedicated to Bhai Jalan, originally a shrine that belonged to what is often described in scholarship as a Khulasa Bhagat, i.e., a devotee who has no religious affiliation, right? He is literally what Khulasa means is free of these affiliation, was also erected by a local Jat family. And we know that Bhai Jalan and his family, who were involved with the building of this shrine, were involved in the land settlement of this area in the 17th century, where much of this area was still not a cultivated space. In 1947, when partition literally and politically fractured Bhai Jalan's followers from the lands across the border that they had historically settled, not just within the Bari Doab in Punjab, but also in the far-off areas of Multan. Let's go to another map. So here, the Bari Doab is in this area between the Beas and Ravi River, and this part of the lower end of this Doab would have been where some of the other lands that Bhai Jalan helped his followers settle and create farmland in. was also then on the other side of this political border. Today, if you go and Google Paijalan, you will see a huge amount of social media posts commemorating the visits of families, descendants of these early settlers, who continue to visit the new shrine, share snippets of oral kathas, which are recordings about Paijalan's life and works, and also sharing snippets of poems that are attributed to him in order to keep the memory of both this Bhagat, but also their shrine and their own family's historical connections to this region alive. Similarly, in the Pakistan border, those with interest in local history are also beginning to document oral histories of these spaces and post them online. So during the past pandemic, I became very interested because I had been studying Paijalan's poetry for a project. But these spaces of contemporary commemoration have become very interesting to me. And it is not at all unusual. If we look around Punjab, similarly thick clusters of digital commemoration can be found all across undivided Punjab on both the India and Pakistan side for similar kinds of rural shrines. So my question is, as these memoryscapes are now moving into the virtual domain where you can visit these places and the communities around them anytime you want, to what extent does the physical geographical space where the shrines still are actually matter? To answer this question, I'm going to look at two unrelated commemorative sites. So one is Pai Bhagat, Jalan Singh's shrine, which I have already said. And you can see how as you zoom out, the two shrines, the one dedicated to the sixth Guru and Pai Jalan, actually become one dot, partly because they are literally so close to each other, right? Barely 100 feet separate those two sites. The second shrine I'm going to look at is in the northern part of Pakistani Punjab, and that is the Takiya of Shah Murad, a regionally prominent, though otherwise not well-known Sufi figure. And this is in the southern border of the Potohar Plateau and the Salt Range, which you see over here on this Google Earth map. My paper explores why such sites and their networks have been remarkably resistant to the attempts of nationalism, religious reform, and shifting linguistic patterns in reshaping the connection and reorienting them to modern forms of identity. In the early post-colonial era, scholars mentioning such shrines often portrayed these as minor actors in the grand narratives of state formation, nation building, and the forging of new modern religious identities for these areas, prominently Sikhism and Islam. They were chiefly seen as holdovers of a vanishing rural world and also likely to be swept away by the juggernaut of modern reform and education. This, as our social media's presence tells us, of course, did not happen quite as the scholars had anticipated. More recent work has focused on the resilience of shrine culture in Punjab and also other regions. The making of modern nation states, such as scholars as Yogesh Nehi, who has done extensive work on similar shrines, remind us, have often very difficult consequences for the vast trans-regional and sprawling community networks of many of Punjab's shrines. Although scholars no longer talk about such spaces in the condescending language of little traditions, recent scholarship has focused on their complicated but still lively presence in contemporary times, rather than attempt the similarly difficult work of understanding the larger communities which connected with such spaces historically and the multiple transitions these communities themselves have undergone. Given the very fragmented textual and material traces of such interactions present in these shrine spaces and the families associated with them, as well as the contested transition of the literary culture of these shrines into print, and very uneasy relationship with contemporary politics in both Punjabs, the job of actually understanding the historical transition in these communities is not very easy. Here I'm building on the work of Yogesh Nehi, whom I've already mentioned, but also Anne Murphy's work with the material culture of Sikh shrines in the spaces and Anna Bigelow's work on the Indian side of Punjab. And what I do here is essentially try to understand the ecological entanglements of these shrine communities in the present. Why? So let's be clear about this purpose. The endeavor here is not a positivist attempt to recover a lost history or study the past origins of contemporary shrine networks teleologically into the past, but to attempt to understand how the relationships forged between the founding families associated with shrines and the communities that became part of their support network emerged in this region. And I do this over the longue durée. By doing this in a comparative way in two different locations, I also seek to bring into focus the importance of relationships between the shrine and global diasporas in which they are now enmeshed. By understanding the broad ecology of relationships, not just to geographical terrain, but also to the ecology of political networking and the ecology of texts invoked by Shantanu Pukhan's work, and looking at how these spaces move forward from the 17th century to the contemporary present, I point to the ways in which spiritual practice and these entangled ecologies created a dense matrix of relationship in the Punjab plains and hills. Building on the still nascent environmental history of the Mughal period and the robust history of its multiple religious communities, I study the entangled ecologies of the shrine of Bhagat Jallan and Shah Murad Khanpuri, as produced by these twinned processes of making places and making networks. Tracing these connections within local networks as well as trans-regional ones reveals the emergence of a shared ethical worldview with resonance for the networks that would record and transmit these cultures into the future. So first, let's do a little bit of geographical and ecological exploration of the spaces in which both of these shrines are actually set. Before the international border divided the villages of Dalla, Padhan, Kanhaye, these are the small villages that are clustered around Baijallan Shrine. These settlements were nestled in the still unsettled tracts between Lahore and Amritsar, and by the 17th century were rapidly being settled by many different kinship groups amongst the Jats, Aryans, and other communities. As we know, this land was prime location for agriculture. That has not changed in the contemporary present because it was a part of the broader Upper Bari alluvial plain. A process that began in the reign of Akbar, this settlement process would also mark the transition of Baijallan's own family. His father was a village level record keeper, a lumbardar, with a large family with multiple sons. Like other Jat clans, these sons would be poised to settle new areas, and I've explored the moving practices of these forms of settlement patterns in my first book. The tracts in these areas have several perennial and seasonal streams in addition to water delivered by the monsoons. However, the depth of alluvial deposits mean that the water level is quite deep, even if multiple streams that existed prior to the extensive modern canalization usually provided ample irrigation. It's actually fairly hard to dig wells because the thick alluvial deposits from the rivers over geological time has actually made the water table quite hard to get. As a colonial official noted in the 19th century, such streams were not reliably present during periods of drought or even during the summer. Quote, "There are many creeks and backwaters, but it is not always the same channels which carry water. Year after year, a creek may regularly flow in the summer and then for many years remain dry owing to a change in the river course," unquote. This made the settlement of farmers and villages in the more arid parts of the Doab a dicey proposition, unless the settlers could rely on other networks of support in times of drought. And as we will see, water management is a huge part of the story that plays out here. The Mughal state had several policies in place to encourage the settlement of arable land all throughout its dominions. Although the sources associated with Baijallan's life do not mention these very specifically, the larger narrative of his father's employment as a revenue collector and the oral historical recollection of a very large grant given to Baijallan in Multan, said to be a grant of about 2,000 bighas of land, point to the parallels between state formation and land settlement in this part of the Bari Doab. Thus, one of the more important historical shifts in the ecology of this area was the rapid settlement of land for agriculture and its rising visibility in the record keeping of the state in this period. Alongside this, we also have fragmentary records of periodic droughts in this area, some related to insufficient monsoon rains, but also to the well-documented El Nino droughts of the 17th century, one of which would happen in the early 1630s, corresponding to the later half of Shah Jahan's reign and the end of Baijalan's life also. In contrast, if we move to our second site, which is the Taki of Shah Murad here, an entirely different geographical terrain comes into view. The tiny settlement of Kanpur is on the edge of the Potehar Plateau in the contemporary district of Chakwal. It is an undulating landscape that has very little in common with the rich agricultural conservation of the Bari Doab. Here, smaller valleys and ravines are subdividing the cultivable land, and this often makes it difficult to cultivate. Not only that, because this is an area famously associated with salt mining, the salt and alkaline content of the soil is very, very large. So one of the problems with using irrigation water in this area is it often actually renders the soil infertile over a long period of time. This is also an area that is well documented, though not by the state, since the state had a very light presence in this area at this time. This region in the Potehar Plateau was often the region which is described as the site of feuding tribes like the Ghakkar, Sials, Mias, and others. It emerges in the Punjabi kissas of the land as an area of feuding, caste biradris, and vendettas that need to be settled. Settlement in this part of the Potehar Plateau was often fortified, and some of you might be familiar with the very big fortress complex of Rohtas, which was put in this area under Sher Shah Suri and continued to change hands multiple times during the Mughal period. It also has close proximity to lakes, rivers, and water sources. So for example, here in the very well-known town of Katas, there is a vast medieval temple complex, but similar kinds of man-made lakes and ponds dot the area. Here again, water is playing a really important role because the Potehar Plateau is a semi-arid area. It doesn't have that kind of lush green landscape that you see in the Eastern Himalayas. The medieval temple fortification of Katas is close by, so are important sites like the historical Tilla Jogya site that is mentioned in the Hirancha epic. But around the area of Kanpur village, which is the location of Shah Murad's shrine, there are multiple layers of history, all that connect this region to this pattern of settlement. And usually what you find are small lakes and ponds. You usually find a hut or ganj, and very often a Sufi shrine or a medieval temple nestled very closely to it, right? But here is a thinly settled population in the 17th century. It's not growing as fast as what is happening in the plains. Historically, agriculture in the Potehar Plateau was less reliable. The economy of this region thus included revenue from mining, especially the salt mines at Khevra, and trade routes from such commodities moved along the back of animals controlled by pastoral communities. They also practiced transhumance, with many pastoral groups moving upland during the summer and then to lower pastures in the winter, which also had an impact on the economy of this region. While not on one of the major routes that connected Lahore with Kashmir, which ran south of Shah Murad's plain. So if we go to the next slide, you will see this if we can just zoom out a little. So this vast oval shaped kind of depression is the valley of Kashmir. Here is the Takia of Shah Murad, and you can see where the rivers have carved out the most commonly used Mughal roads into Kashmir. The one that ran from Rajouri in the southern route off to Lahore was just south of the Takia, and then the northern route that went through the northern part of the valley through Rawalpindi and then on to Kabul was the other one. But connecting between these were many, many tracks that were used by pastoral groups as part of the seasonal migration. And the Takia lay along those routes and also the routes that went into Jhelum. So in other words, it is connected. It is just connected on a minor network rather than one of those major networks that often pop up in the Mughal sources. Shah Murad's family were trained as qazis and had settled in the Kanpur region some generation back before he was born in 1627. Thus, unlike Baijalan, he was able to get a very long-lasting foundational education in Arabic and Persian, as well as in law of fiqh. His family's longer-term connections with these diverse communities settled in the Kanpur-Chakwal region also assured that the transmission of Shah Murad's verses in Persian Punjabi, as well as in this new trend of writing Rekhta poetry, i.e. poetry of mixed Persian and vernacular, would be amply documented in his own lifetime. The long-term zamindars of this village were originally a Hindu family descended from one Izzat Rai, and they were the ones who preserved the most widely circulated version of Shah Murad's verses in their bayaz. Eventually, parts of this bayaz that was handed down through the family and copied and recopied many times would lead one of their descendants, Gulab Rai, to publish it in the 19th century, around 1862. And even many generations later, Gulab Rai considered himself a murid of Shah Murad, not just in the sense of having a spiritual peer, but also in terms of being a master poet or ustad, right? So Gulab Rai in this bayaz is writing jawabs back to Shah Murad. So now that we have a closer understanding of the geography and terrain, let's move to the political geography that is happening. And here, by the way, is the entrance to Shah Murad's shrine. It's a small space, but as you can see, it's very well preserved even today. If we turn then to the topography and from the topography to the communities associated with these shrines, what appears very crucial is both men were embedded in local networks that were going to be responsible for the transmission of verses and also memories and stories about their lives. Now, it's very possible to have studied these relationships in the way Bhakti and Sufi figures have traditionally been studied by scholars of religion, because both Pai Jalan and Shah Murad have left behind a corpus. Pai Jalan's work are preserved in several different scripts. The oldest manuscript is likely an undated compilation in a Poti in Khalsa College, Amritsar, manuscript 1437. Similarly, Shah Murad's Khans can be found sprinkled in many manuscripts created by the Qadri Takia that he belonged to. The one that has been more closely dated and studied is the British Library's Punjabi manuscript B36, which has fragmentary pieces of his poem, including one complete Siharfi. However, there is a problem. A close examination of these collections reveals that almost all these manuscript copies were made much later than the known lifetimes of both these men. In Pai Jalan's case, the manuscript in the Khalsa College collection appears to date from the 18th century, and it's a collection that is bound with the verses of several other Punjabi Bhagats, such as Sutra Shah, another one of Pai Jalan and Guru Har Gobind Dev's contemporaries, but also the Dadapanthi figure Vajid, as well as Kabir and Surdas. It suggests that the manuscript itself was used for liturgical purposes or for a performative context that was not really concerned about sectarian boundaries. Now, this is not at all unusual. We often find these kinds of compilations in which the poems of famous Bhakti and Sufi figures have been bound together. In the case of Shah Murad, the bayaz that his murids appear to have circulated locally in Kanpur and Chakwal appears to have mostly been made in this region. The British Library collection, the manuscript itself does have a date. It is dated to 1854-55, and the scribe's name is Ubaiduddin, who identifies himself as the Khadim of the Dargah Mumahati. Now, it's not really clear whether this is one of these local shrines that is closer to Kanpur or one of the better known dargahs that was dedicated to Shah Muhammad Bukhari of Sindh, which are actually very well known because no actual information is given about where this manuscript was actually collected. The more important point I'm making is there is not a single contemporary autographed manuscript of either Pai Jalan's verses or those of Shah Murad. This suggests that the transmission of their composition, as well as the continued commemoration of their lives and memory, was dependent on the communities that grew up around these figures during their lifetime. The composition of kathas, or songs about recitations of Bhai Jalan's life, seem to have been circulating outside of this area of his natal village also. We know, for example, that Bhai Santokh Singh mentions him in his monumental work, Gur Pratap Suraj Granth, that was completed in 1844. And even today, we get many live performances of this and other kathas about Bhai Jalan, some of which, by the way, can be found on the outline. I'm just going to scoot ahead. Here's a recorded live performance of one of these jathas that goes to Gurudwaras and does these katha celebrations. All right. Given the fragmentary traces in oral, textual, and built environments connected with Baba Jallan's life, what can we say about the communities that were attached to him? One important linkage in the transmission of texts and memories appears to be familial, and the other linked with kinship groups, largely of Jats settled in this area. Bhai Jallan's wife, Bibi Ramki, is mentioned in oral narratives and continues to be depicted in contemporary oral work. Let's go back to that slide I showed you. Here is Bibi Ramki, his wife, and here is Bhai Jallan in a contemporary pictorial depiction. The oral history circulating among the families charged with the caretaking of the shrine offer two reasons for this close familial relationship. Baba Jallan and Bibi Ramki lost their two young sons during their lifetime. Ramki is praised for her steadfast devotion to her husband and the care and feeding of his devotees. They had a langar in their family home, in other words. The land associated with the shrine, therefore, passed upon Jallan's death to that of his younger brother Golu and his descendants, and in fact, that continued into the 19th century. More important, both Baba Jallan and his brother did not live in the normative patrilocal pattern associated with Punjab. Usually, sons stay in their father's regions or go and find new settlements. Instead, oral histories report that Jallan was given the land around village Dalla by Bibi Ramki's father. At that time, it was part of an uncultivated waste or banjar, and even today it is in the more arid parts of the Bari Doab. If these histories are factual, they suggest a pattern of settlement in which marital ties were important to claiming new land, a pattern that I have discussed in my earlier work on the kings of Patiala and the Pulkya states. But in some ways, the story of Jalla and Ramki are actually quite atypical. In the oral histories, they are not depicted as living the life associated with chiefs, zamindars, which is often the case for the families that first initiate the settlement process. Instead, Jalla is often described as cultivating his fields himself, and Bibi Ramki as preoccupied with the hard physical labor of domestic work, including grinding of grains herself with no staff, in order to feed the large crowds that show up at the langar. If he helped other clans settle the area and also received land grants to settle lands in Multan from Shah Jahan, it was not in the entrepreneurial style familiar to historians of the Mughal period, in which those often involved in projects became revenue collectors and hereditary chiefs of those areas. If anything, the oral histories and contemporary kathas narrate this imperial connection not as the more familiar pattern of land settlement associated with Sufi figures and bhaks, as explored in the work of Richard Eaton and Tony Stewart in Bengal, but as miracle stories in which Bhai Jallan's failure to pay revenue to Shah Jahan's court in a timely manner leads to a series of imprisonments, and then, of course, miracles performed by Bhai Jallan, in which he and Bibi Ramki are then set free, leaving the Mughal emperor amazed at his miraculous powers. Now, of course, what I find interesting about these oral histories are not any kind of facticity, but the fact that this relationship with the imperial court was known enough that it needed to be explained in some way to the devotional community that had grown up around the site. Similarly, oral histories of the families that came from these new settlements associated with Bhai Jallan and Bibi Ramki's joint efforts affirmed the historic bonds of Jallan's devotees from Multan and Punjab to his aiding of their own family settlement. But these also recount that it was an intercaste effort. This relationship elevated their families into a more secure financial future without necessarily elevating Jalla's lineage in some kind of worldly terms, but certainly raised it in terms of Jallan's spiritual status. Jallan is said to have created village settlements with Khatris, Jats, as well as many Dalit castes. He himself, however, never claimed a zamindari. Yet the bonds between Jallan's lineage and the devotional community that sprung up around his shrine commemorating this relationship has endured over 300 years, as testified by the continued visits to his shrine by these families even post-partition. The built environment of the shrine at Naushehra Dallan, so these two villages combined in the 20th century, also offers some clues to these community networks. The shrine itself seems to have bordered the takia of a local Sufi saint, which is no longer extant. Within the shrine complex is a small enclosure with a shivling. So if you walk into the shrine, The larger chambers have the Samadhi of Bhai Jallan and also areas depicting his and Bibi Ramki's life. But off to a smaller enclosure, you find the Shivling. And you can't see it here, but on these pictures around this complex, you have depictions of the Sikh gurus, but also Shiva and Parvati. So it's an interesting mix. Those posting social media content on visits to the shrine display neither surprise nor comments on these placements, which would certainly have invited some vitriol from an earlier generation of reform-minded Sikhs, and even from more orthodox Sikhs today. However, these are not unusual in rural shrines and samadhis in Punjab. Interestingly also, close to the shrine is a bauli, a step well that was commissioned by Bhai Jallan and created with the help of the local Jat Sikh families in that area. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, within a short walk of the complex, now inaccessible due to the Indo-Pakistan border, there is a Gurudwara dedicated to the Sikh Guru Har Gobind. It was built by the dominant Sandhujat chief of the area and commemorates Guru Har Gobind's visit to that area, where he's also said to have met Bhai Jallan. However, most visitors to the shrine today describe Bhai Jallan's shrine as a Gurudwara. Notably, however, in the mural and paintings at the shrine, Bhai Jallan is depicted not as a Sikh, but as a Bhagat. So I'll go back again to the illustration we have seen. Often dressed simply in a loincloth or in other pictures in short saffron robes. The many honorifics attached to Jallan in local memory also hint at the different communities that claim him. He is Pai, an honorific given to the Reverend Learned Sikhs, but also Baba, as is more common to many Punjabi Sufis in this local milieu, and then Bhagat, but also Khulasa Bhagat, a word associated with sons of the Bhakti community. These scholarly works, the few that have studied this phenomena, identify and describe Jallan as a Khulasa Bhagat, an unaffiliated devotee, which stems from Jallan's own avoidance of sectarian labels in his composition. In the case of Bhai Murad, if we move to the different shrine that we are looking at, his family already had white settlements all through the Chakwal Chelam area as qazis, educators, prominent scholars in several villages and towns in the Potahar plateau. And this is an important element in the preservation of his life and works as well. The earliest scholarly explorations of his work were able to create and find a shajra or genealogical chart of his lineage. Clearly, his family had been long resident in this area of Chakwal district. The document also shows that Shah Murad himself, just like Bhai Jallan, had left no male inheritors, but only 2 daughters. So the caretaking of his shrine also then passes to a younger brother. Much like Jallan, his works and memories appear to have been preserved not by his own kin, but by his students and devotees. The takiya of Shah Murad is fairly modest, and you see the modern the descendant of this family in front of the Shah Murad's grave over here. But it continues to be an important local institution. By the way, you can see this because the businesses in this area are all named after him. There's an auto repair shop, that is Baba Murad Auto Repair Shop. There is a sweets shop that is named after him. And similarly, if you go to the Shahnala, there is a sports gym named after Bhai Jallan. So he does linger in local memory in quite distinctive ways. In Kanpur, an annual Urs 2 days after Bakra Eid still attracts many devotees. And the recitation and printing of Baba Murad's verses are also enjoyed still locally with almost a century of print circulation due to the zeal of those who consider him an important peer and poet for this region. Even if Shah Murad has received very limited scholarly attention, his local influence therefore remains quite strong. Now, how do we understand this? Let's go back to the fact that his family were qazis, right? And this was a post that often became hereditary in the late Mughal period. The work of Farhat Hassan and Nandini Chatterjee has alerted us to the many facets of qazis and scholars of fiqh within their hometown communities. Rather than the haughty orthodox figures that emerge from the poetic tropes in Persian poetry or Bhakti compositions, we know that the quotidian duties of local qazis implied a great deal of interaction with diverse communities in the towns and villages in which they served. In their notarization of wills, property deeds, marriage settlements. They served not just Muslim communities, but also men and women from many different religious communities and castes. As prominent civic figures in their communities, they were accorded a great deal of respect and are often mentioned in local histories and tazkiras. We also know that scholars of fiqh, even when they were not serving in an official capacity as a qazi, often dispensed legal advice, educated young children, and often amassed a reputation as men of learning. And we know that from the record in part because many of these people do get land grants, not just from the Mughal emperors, but also from the Sikh chiefs that follow in order to help them preserve the local taqiyas and madrasas in which education was being offered to local children. While there has been a tendency to view Sufis and Qazis as occupying very different poles of a binary of orthodoxy and unorthodoxy, the biographies of several well-known mystics reveal that they too were in fact trained as fiqh scholars, and several legal scholars were also inclined towards mysticism. So in actual life, this is not a binary. In other words, the process is really more of a continuum and quite scrambled. In the small community of Kanpur, which already had scholars from Shiraz and Bukhara associated with this region, whose graves are still there, Shah Murad's learning and erudition would have been noted and appreciated. For a region in close proximity to trade routes and in which intercommunal patterns of settlement partnerships, but with limited access to educational opportunities, the services provided by Shah Murad's works were by his family were often a necessity for local communities. Tellingly, the family that preserved Shah Murad's works were nominally Hindu, but the Bayaz records poems both for their literary merit as well as their mystical depth. In other words, it's not clear to me that the communities were always reading them from this mystical perspective. They very much might have enjoyed and read them in majlises as poetic works. The continued circulation of manuscripts, oral performance, and majlises at both the annual Urs and on other occasions kept Shah Murad's poetic corpus preserved in the community for multiple generations. One reason may be that Shah Murad, like Bhai Jallan, appears to have engaged with several literary trends of his own time. His works, though brief in quantity, are very diverse linguistically, featuring Punjabi, Persian, and also Rehta compositions. The genres span ghazals, qasidas, and also Punjabi genres like dohra, baramasa, siharfi. In other words, touching both the elite levels of formal metric composition in Persian, but also folk genres of Punjabi, and mixing and innovating within these established forms, as we shall see when I share some of these with you. To understand how these compositions drew in an audience and created a powerful hold both on listeners in the 17th century, but even today, let's turn to discussing the ecology of text. And I'm using that phrase borrowed from Shantanu Phukanworks, who reminds us that it's never accidental what works and words poets choose or the genres that they choose to write in. Both Bhai Jallan and Shah Murad lived in the midst of multilingual communities and an awareness of sectarian debates. Baba Jallan's lifetime overlapped with the efforts of the Sikh intellectual Bhai Gurdas, whose copious literary outputs helped to define the Sikh Panth of Guru Har Gobind's time at a time in which contenders of the Guruship were plentiful. And I'll be happy to talk about this context. It's well documented and studied in scholarship. References in these sectarian works also show an awareness of the growing popularity of Vaishnav Bhakti in Punjab. Several texts, both vernacular and Persian, have also charted the growing influence of Chishti, Naqshbandi, and Qadri Sufi centers in this period in both the regions of Punjab that I discuss in this paper. Yet what is striking in Jallan's poetry is the lack of concern with sectarian ideologies and claims as rival groups. Rather, he engages with these strains in his work. So here is a quote, you have it on the screen too. Ram naam jin gaya, aukhad aru kuch tant namant, Ram naam japu karhe Jallan, sei kariye pure sant. So whoever sings the name of the Lord has no need of the medicine of magical formulas, tantar mantar in Hindi, if that's you're more familiar with that. When he recites the name of the Lord Jallan, he becomes the true ascetic. Although here we see a deployment of tropes common in Bhakti poetry, as well as the importance to Naam Simran in the Sikh tradition, the idea itself had and continues to have very wide resonance along religious lines. A very similar verse, picking up the same themes, also repackages this idea in a slightly different, more Persianate register. So darvish ek te dir dekhe, galman sokhe dir man bheke, kahave be din man phuke, saas mein sahib ke khave, jallandas tad darga darvish kahave. That dervish who steadfastly gazes and steadfastly fixes his mind on the divine. He is satisfied as he recites Deen, Deen. With every breath he takes, what the master gives, Jalnadas. It is then that he can be called a true dervish or ascetic. Both these Sakhis describe the true devotee or ascetic, but not in a way that attempts to highlight a sectarian difference. Rather, both types are praised for their steadfast devotion and for closely following what Janla praises as the true road to the divine, reciting the name of God and meditating on God. The switch to a more Persianate register does not emphasize a greater or lesser approach to the goal, merely another variation of appropriate and mindful meditation. Now, there is an implied criticism here, of course. What Jalla is saying, there are people who don't do this and they're not worthy of being considered bhagats or darvishes, right? It is not that Jallan has no criticism to offer. In fact, he has what we would call a tikhi zaban. In other words, quite pointed. Many Punjabi scholars who have studied him often compare him to Kabir, and that's probably, not the best way to explain what he is doing, but it gets the point of what it sounds like in the original Punjabi across. Many of his poems have a sharp critique for what Jalla sees as the hypocrisy of worldly people. So here's another quote. Kahe kuch hor, kare kuch hor. Jaan ho deen duniya ka chor. Right? So somebody who says one thing and does another, know that he is a thief in both this world and the next. Jalla also criticizes the overly selfish view of religious goals that only focus on personal fulfillment than the larger goal of liberation or helping others reach that goal. Are Pandya, tere narak ki parwah na rakho, tere baikunt ko lat maro. Right? Oh Pandit, don't be so concerned about your own heaven. Kick that hell away. Right? So here again, we see a testing of religious hierarchical boundaries, but not in any ways that are really kind of pushing against the trend we already are familiar with in Bhakti and Sufi tropes. This salty colloquial register is familiar to the world of Bhakti practice and also to scholarship. Bhai Jallan's continued circulation in his region of Punjab is not surprising if we consider the multiple strands of popular devotion both his literary practice and thematic content engage. The verses are eminently suitable to both performance and oral recitation. The colloquial expression is accessible, but also, unlike poets of the time with a stronger sectarian attachment, Jalla's poems make no demands for the listener to forsake other paths or teachers. Instead, they critique vices commonly abhorred in many traditions, things like selfishness, hypocrisy, false pride, and social status. Jalla has multiple verses identifying Maya or worldly illusion as the chief cause of unhappiness and wasted effort. And if you think about the kind of boom and bust cycles that are happening in agrarian communities in this time period as they get connected to a 17th century growing global economy, we can see how they might have had resonance for his original audience, but continue to have resonance even today. In contrast, his praise for Nam Simran, meditative practice, charity, consistency of thought and action are all virtues in other traditions as well. For people exposed to the poetry of Kabir, Baba Farid, and the first 5 Sikh gurus, as many of Jallan's original audiences would have been in the 17th century, there is both something innately familiar to the tones and themes in Jallan's poetry, also nothing objectionable. We can see how for a family actively engaged in land settlement and farming, this profile would have had much appeal. The continued presence of diverse skin groups, castes, and visitors from the region that document visits to Bhai Jallan's shrine today are in many ways continuing an older tradition in a new medium. So if we turn to the early Sikh editors of Bhai Jallan's poems, and they are the ones who first publish it in print, they often comment readily on the difficulty of comparing manuscripts of his work because very often these manuscripts were in different scripts. But whether in Devanagari, Gurmukhi, or Shamukhi, which is Arabic script Punjabi, we can see that the language itself is not that difficult. It is very accessible to a wide range of Northern Indian linguistic speakers and even those who are not familiar with the local dialect. At a time when many different communities were intent on clarifying sectarian and religious boundaries in the 17th century, which is well documented, Jalan's refusal to refer to his own community as a distinct sampradaya or prant, or claim leadership, or define his own religious attachment to any one group is notable. What he does is often use the name Hari or Ram, but that too, as was the case with Kabir and also with many others quoted in the Sikh scripture, is not unusual for the wider Bhakti world. His documented interaction with Guru Har Gobind similarly does not lead to a claiming of a Sikh identity within the verses that survive. In the context of other rural shrines in Punjab, however, this is not at all unusual. As Yogesh Snehi and others have documented, the shrines occupy a place of shared worship and even shared institutional spaces with multiple groups. The ecology of Shah Murad's verses, if we turn to our other poet, overlaps with that of Bhai Jallan, but also extends to other spaces and other networks. For one, Shah Murad's works span three languages: the vernacular Punjabi, Persian, and the new trend of late 17th century Rekhta. So Rekhta is emerging as a very, very new literary practice in the late 1600s. In the mid-20th century, a brief flurry of interest in Shah Murad's work occurred within Urdu scholarship, as until that time, the idea that nascent forms of modern literary Urdu, which then were identified in scholarship with Dakhni and Rekhta, did not have a presence in North India until the reign of Muhammad Shah. Yet Shah Murad's work is a generation earlier than these poets writing in Muhammad Shah's court. In contrast to the vast attention on his slim Rekhta corpus, very little work has actually been done on his Persian and Punjabi poetry. And mainly in the 1930s and 40s, scholars were really excited to find this Northern Indian example. And post-1947, it became part of a basis for claiming that Urdu had a natural presence in Northern Pakistan, even though this is actually perhaps a solitary example. What is unusual about these verses is that they take a macaronic form. So no matter what language you're looking at, the language actually doesn't stay put even often in the same poem. While modern print editions of Shah Murad's work carefully separate out verses into linguistically defined sections of Persian, Punjabi, Urdu, this kind of linguistic surgery is actually impossible for the Punjabi section. Let's see why. For one, although Shah Murad composed in many familiar Punjabi genres, Dohra, Siharfi, Barama, he also innovated genres by grafting the rules of the Persian and Rekhta ghazal into Punjabi. Some compositions do this very smoothly, picking up on the Masnavi-like structure of longer Punjabi kissas, but for shorter compositions. And you can tell them because the end rhymes of the verses are different. Here is one from Shah Murad. The opening verses evoke the natural world, and I seem to be missing it on the screen, but I will read it around. Mixing the forms of love often found in the Persian ghazal, but also in Bhakti Kavya. So here is a verse from one that is not a ghazal, but following this older Masnavi pattern. Marna rah prem de, je bukh na rahe dimag, machli jaldi jalbin, parwa vik charak. Bulbul bakhe gulbin, rondi zar ozar, kumri kuke sarobin, kad ajayib yar. So let me translate for those of you not familiar with Punjabi. When dying on the path of love, the mind is not conscious of hunger. The fish burns without the water, the moth unspying the lamp. Without the rose, the nightingale laments loudly. The turtle dove cries out without the cypress. Without its stature, how can it know the wonder of the beloved, right? So very clearly here, he's taking these tropes like the rose, the bulbul, etc., that we are very familiar with in Persian ghazal poetry, and reading it into this new adapted form in Punjabi. The next few verses revisit the torments suffered by Yusuf and Zulekha, Leila and Majnu, but also the famous lovers of Punjabi kissas, Sasi Punu, Hiranja, Having established this theme, Shah Murad now turns to the larger theme and purpose of human love. And interestingly here, it is not a romantic love. So let's listen closely. Ishq majazi pul banana, aukha rah barik, is pul par nahi khilona, jhar dar pandi lik. Hindu Musalman jo adam di aulad, sage bhai roop, aap vich khanda kehda Shah Murad. So, taking up the theme of ishq majazi or worldly love, make this worldly love your bridge. This difficult path is narrow. This bridge is not for play. The foot will not stray from the path. The Hindu and the Muslim, who are all Adam's progeny, are true brothers, says Shah Murad. This is not some bland restatement of the discussions about ishq majazi versus ishq hakiki or true love, a common Sufi theme. Instead, Shah Murad shifts his reading of the nature of love twice in that same poem. First, from the theme of symbolic pairs that signify love in poetry, the moth and the flame, the rose and the nightingale, to actual human lovers, Laila Majnu Sasi Punu, and then finally to the theme of brotherly love. It is not that Shah Murad, like Jallan, rejects sectarian labels. His poems often affirm his Qadri affiliation and also develop several poems on the theme of Ramzan, the importance of the Sunnah, and prayers to Allah. Rather, his larger point in this and other poems is that an affiliation with one community does not foreclose affectionate ties with someone from another one. The poetic space for Shah Murad is not one of sectarian competition, but of shared sociability. This is also reflected in Shah Murad's use of macaronic verse, which also feature many early forms of Rekhta, in which verses begin in one language but end in the other. Now, Heidi Powells, my colleague here at the University of Washington, and I are doing a project on early Rekhta. We just submitted the book, and we looked at some of his Urdu verses, but here I want to show a similar practice in Punjabi. So here you can see verse 3 from one of these newly formed Punjabi ghazals. And we know it is a ghazal because it has the same end rhyme and each of the verses are in the same metric pattern. Ishq dilam shahbaz shikarsh murg-e waslat ma binam mir shikari husn tumhara hardam kyu hai piya. Right? So the first part of the hemistich is in Farsi and the second part of the hemistich is in Punjabi. Love hunts my heart like a royal falcon. I see the bird of union with me. The chief hunter, the Mir Shikari, is your beauty in every breath, O love. There are several lines like this, and then the penultimate line is Rekhta ra har guft in rekhta digar rekhta as. Sanjhe luft te sanjhe hai mane us isme nahi kuch biriya. Every person recites Rekhta. So here he's acknowledging this is getting to be a kind of popular literary fad of his own time. This Rekhta is different from the rest, feeling joy and sensing it as if there is nothing in it that is without sincerity. So the use of bireya or sincerity is kind of interesting here. This ghazal explores the theme of vasal or union with the divine, but then also takes up the auditory process of the sama, the musical gathering at which many ghazals were recited or sung. And many of his pieces are like that, right? They're obviously written for a sama or a literary majlis. Shah Murad brings attention to his experiments with the new form of Rekhta, in which paired hemistiches of Persian and the vernacular heighten an audience's experience of the theme of love. But unlike the Rekhta often written for a more sophisticated literary majlis, Shah Murad explains that there are no hidden devices or symbols. Kind of like what you see is what you get, or in this case, what you hear is what you get. Like the heart of the lover that is the sure prey for love, the hearts of the listeners are swamped by feelings of pleasure or lutf. Here, Shah Murad does something unexpected. He does not, like many mystical poets do, hint at the hidden mysteries of mystical love or the complicated and difficult path of mystics. Instead, the aesthetic of poetry and sama are praised as being able to instantly transport the listener. Just like his framing of ishq majazi, not into romantic love, but brotherly love, Shah Murad insists on the accessible nature of love, not its limitations or its esoteric and inaccessible nature, except for those few mystic adepts. For a teacher and convener of a regional majlis, Shah Murad strives to be accessible in many of his poems. Even in a small village such as Kanpur, it is clear that he was well connected with the literary trends of the time, commenting on his own enthusiasm for what he calls the Dakhani style of Rekta and repurposing it for his Punjabi audience. The longer-term influence he exercised long past his own lifetime among local poets writing in Punjabi, Persian, and later Urdu and Hindi gives us a glimpse of the space of the Sufi taqiyya as an engine of literary innovation and circulation. Surely then, these are not, as one scholar thought, little traditions, but mighty ones. All right, to conclude. Returning to the present day, we can see that shrines like that of Bhai Jalla and Shah Murad are places that commemorate a shared past, often with a very local focus and flavor. The transmission and migration of the verses of both Baba Jalla and Shah Murad has continued, but with changing technologies. As manuscripts gave way to print and then print to the virtual space of the internet, communities connected with these shrines and have continued to harness new communicative technologies. But the rituals of marking important family occasions, a return to the home village after time away, marriages, births, local festivals, continue the life of the shrine. Performative and oral traditions circulate as well, both amateur and professional in new forms. For communities that have seen much disruption and dislocation, particularly as this part of Punjab has long been a hub of outmigration and diasporic returns, the shrine itself also serves as a symbolic space of past connections to the regions, homes that often no longer exist, and increasingly what social media sites relabel as heritage spaces. Very often, some of the people posting have actually never lived there, right? But they maintain this connection. If the Bari Doab has long been a center of global diasporic waves out of Punjab, the Potahar Plateau has been the nexus of military men and migrants leaving home for work, a wave that still continues. The Pakistani army recruits quite heavily from that region still. Yet for every journey out, it seems there is also the ritual of return. In this context, the shifting ecology of Bhai Jallan's life in virtual kathas, podcasts, and then the reframing of his verses serves as a readily accessible and a contemporary 20th century fandom as well. And the urs of Shah Murad, shared on social media sites, invites new and old listeners into this new shared virtual space. The physical space of the shrine, even when anchored in the virtual space of the internet, still holds together the social ecology of the networks, the literary ecology of the poems and song, and knits together the growing community of the shrine. In other words, place still matters. Thank you.